You are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. Today is June 15th, 2025, and this is another episode of Lighthearted Light. Today we'll be listening to an edited version of an interview that was originally heard in July 2020. The guest is John Anderson, and the subject is the College of the Atlantic's research station on Great Duck Island in Maine. This makes a nice companion piece to the interview with Sean Todd about the college's research center on Mount Desert Rock, which we heard recently. Maine's Great Duck Island is more than 200 acres in size and about 9 miles south of the much larger Mount Desert Island. A light station was established on Great Duck Island in 1890 with a 42-foot tall brick tower and 3 keepers' dwellings. Only one of the 3 houses remains standing today. The light was automated in 1986 and it remains an active aid to navigation. In 1998, Great Duck Island Light Station, along with Mount Desert Rock Light Station, became the property of Bar Harbor's College of the Atlantic under the Maine Lights program. Students and staff from the college now live in the former keeper's dwelling much of the year. The ongoing research projects on the island include the monitoring of the large nesting gull population, as well as detailed study of black guillemots and the nocturnal Leach's storm petrel. John Anderson has been a professor at College of the Atlantic for more than 30 years. His field research centers around Great Duck Island. John says that he is interested in the intersection between natural history and human history in relation to long-term ecological processes. Let's listen to my conversation with John Anderson now. What sorts of research are done there by you and the students from College of the Atlantic?
In a typical summer, I bring between 4 and 8 students out to the island in June and July, and they work with me on a range of projects. Most of them do relate to either botany or zoology, but we also encourage the arts. And so there have been some really magical art students who've come out to the island and spent the summer drawing and painting, and just really trying to convey the nature of the island as part of their work. But the sort of questions we're really interested in is what's happening with the seabird populations on the island. We've seen over the last 22 years a huge shift in where the herring and blackback gulls are nesting. So we map the whole island into our geographic information system. So we have everything in the computer, and we can compare one year to the next to see where the birds are and changes in vegetation structure. And that in itself is a pretty big undertaking, but that's not really science, that's just data collection. The science comes in trying to analyze why the changes that we see are occurring. And one of the things that we're really very interested in and concerned about is the impact of bald eagles on seabird colonies up and down the coast. And over the last decade, we've seen an enormous increase in the frequency and intensity of bald eagle predation on the island. And the bald eagles seem to have driven the gulls from the north end of the island, which is largely unoccupied by people, down to the light station. When we first came out, we rather naively thought that, okay, the station had been abandoned for 15 years. There were there were about 100 pairs of gulls down around the station, and we worried that us being there in the summer during the breeding season might drive the birds away. And that's why we started mapping the precise location of nests. But much to our surprise, we found that every year we've had more gulls nesting in the vicinity of the station rather than less, some of them very close indeed to the house and the lighthouse. And actually, when we go back into the historical record and read the accounts of the lightkeepers specifically say that the gulls were all nesting in and around the station. So just at the northern boundary of the station in those days, there was a fence that marked the federal limit of the property. As far as I can tell, virtually all the gulls in the first quarter of the 20th century were nesting inside that fence around the station buildings. And the lightkeepers and their families were acting as wardens and guardians of the birds and keeping them safe from any sort of hunting. I don't think there's any ancestral memory of that, but in a weird way, we're doing the same thing, only we're not protecting the birds from human hunters. Our presence does seem to dissuade the bald eagles. We don't do anything active to chase the bald eagles off. That would be both illegal and unethical, we think. But just us up in the lighthouse tower, we see the bald eagles coming down the island. They see us, and they make a U-turn and go back up to the north end. So we're really interested in that. We're really interested in the petrel breeding biology, where they're nesting on the island. We're also interested in the black guillemots. They're one of the less abundant Maine birds, but great duck is one of the centers of their population. So depending on who's doing the counting, either great duck or Penobscot Seal Island are the biggest colonies of black guillemots in the state. And so every couple of years, we try and map the location of guillemot nesting around the perimeter of the island, and we're keeping track on what they're feeding on. We're also really interested in common eider. Common eider used to be a very common sea duck here in Maine. The numbers seem to have declined tremendously, and so we're trying to monitor as closely as we can the survival of the ducklings, and we can do that from the lighthouse tower without bothering them. So it's a wonderful platform for doing that sort of work. As long as we're up in the tower, we see no signs that the birds are bothered by us, and we can keep track of what they're doing, what they're feeding on, and if anyone is going after them. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the general things we do out there.
Is it important to protect gull populations, and if so, why is that important?
That's always a question that seems to pop up. You know, gulls have the curse of being in a lot of people's minds, but without people really understanding as much as I'd love them to about both the biology and, if you will, the folklore of gulls. Gulls aren't really seabirds. They're found inland, so there are big colonies of California gulls on the Great Salt Lake and places like that in the heart of the continent. Gulls tend to be along shorelines, either lake shorelines or the marine shoreline. And, you know, you read the accounts of mariners going all the way back 1,000 years, and gulls aren't a sign of the deep. They're a sign you're getting close to land. And so they're sort of part of our background, if you will, when we go down to the beach and, oh, yes, there's a gull. Populations of gulls increased a great deal with protection at the end of the 19th and the first quarter of the 20th century. But one of the really frightening things that's happening is that the population of virtually all the gulls in the northern hemisphere has been declining very dramatically in the last 25 to 30 years. And we'd noticed this happening here in Maine, and then I put together a symposium in Germany and just sent out messages to my friends who studied gulls and said, let's all get together and compare notes about what our gulls are doing as part of the Waterbird Society meetings in Wilhelmshaven. And so we got people from the U.S., Canada, Germany, Great Britain, Europe, and we all were comparing our notes, and everybody's populations were going down. And it seems that something very strange is happening all around the North Atlantic basin that we don't really understand. And that's really frightening because it probably suggests there isn't just one cause. There are several different things happening. And so, you know, quite apart from the fact that I think gulls are incredibly beautiful and they're a wonderful sort of expression of the wild, they're also potential tripwires that can warn us against real ecological problems. And when you see a species that seems, or a group of species, because this isn't just herring gulls and it isn't just blackback gulls, but when you see a whole group of species that have quite a broad ecology and are suddenly going into decline, that's a real worry. All too often when we think about conservation, we don't start thinking really seriously about conservation until we're down to the last few dozen individuals. And by then, it's quite often too late. So I'd much rather that we would start thinking conservation when we still have fairly sizable populations, rather than waiting until they're almost all gone.
I was just wondering if you ever kind of feel like a modern Darwin? And maybe like, do you feel like Great Duck Island is your Galapagos? Is that something that ever occurs to you?
I have no illusions about my intellect. So, Darwin is absolutely my hero. And, I do find it incredibly sad. We've had billions of years of the Earth, and I miss him by what doesn't even amount to a hair's breadth. What I wouldn't give to take a walk with him around the sandwalk and talk to him about ecology and evolution. It would be such a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I think that the closest I can claim to real relationship with Darwin is that Darwin didn't ever describe himself as a scientist. That word wasn't really very common in his time. He said that he was a man much interested in natural history. And I'm much interested in natural history. And there are, I think, I would like to believe once again, a growing group of us who feel that natural history is actually a critical component of the sciences that has been neglected for too long. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do with Great Duck in terms of training the next generation of scientists. So the really important thing about the island is it gives the student the opportunity to observe very closely and in an organized fashion over the course of a whole season, or some of them come back for more than one season. And it's out of that close observation that come the really interesting questions. And that's what we saw Darwin doing. So Darwin, when he's going around the world in the Beagle, it's not like he's got this theory that he's planning to prove. He's got ideas, but he's taking really, really good notes of geology and botany and zoology. Everything that comes across his bows, he's intrigued with and he's making notes about. And it's out of that sort of massive information that he develops what he calls his long argument, which is evolution by natural selection. And I think that's a really important way to do science. And I also think it's really important for students who aren't going to be scientists to have that experience. So it really troubles me that all too often, it seems these days, students are told that being a scientist involves going into a lab and learning a technique, which may be kind of cool right now, but it's going to be out of date in 5 years. And that's the end of their science training. And then years later, they're trying to be on the local town conservation commission, or they're being asked to testify before some board somewhere. And they don't have the skills of careful observation in the field that they're going to need to really be able to give the information that's going to be important in people's everyday lives. So what the island really is it's a place for that very careful contemplation, out of which comes the really important questions. And again, this is where I think the fact that it's a light island is so important, because we don't make any bones about it. This is an island that people have lived on and off for 200 years. And their presence on the island has shaped the place in very important ways. And one of the things I love is that when we look into the history of the Lite station, Great Duck had 3 families looking after the Lite. And in those days, families were very big. So at one point, there were more than 30 children on the island. And yet there were still nesting seabirds. And that's critically important when we look at the world today, because what that says is that done right, even in a really constricted, restrained place like a small island, you can have quite a few people and the wild living right next to each other and getting along. And that's a very different model than you get from some conservationists who say, humans bad, what we need to do is fence off the wild from them, keep them out. I think that's a really, really short-sighted strategy for conservation. If you tell people enough they're bad and you tell them that you can't go there, you can't actually see stuff, how do you expect them to be excited enough to protect things? But if you say, this is something that is very beautiful and very fragile, look at it very carefully and enjoy it, that's when people fall in love. And that's when they're willing to actually do conservation. And so I think these light islands are wonderful sort of labs where we can show this sort of co-equal history and natural history, where organisms have got along surprisingly well for quite a long time.
You also mentioned in your bio that you have a deep and abiding love of poetry. And I'm wondering if there are any particular poems or poets that you think of when you think of Great Duck Island.
I love a huge range of poets. T.S. Eliot is one of my absolute favorites in all the world. And he weaves the sea into a number of his poems. His poem, Marina, is an absolutely wonderful thing to think about when you're walking through the forest on Great Duck. What bays, what shores, what islands through the fog, what images return, O my daughter. That's what the island's like. There's also a wonderful poem by Rachel Field that I read to all of the students when they come out to the island, Once You've Slept on an Island.
Mm-hmm.
And, the last lines, once you've slept on an island, you'll never be quite the same.
Yep.
And it's absolutely true. Another poem that I always read to everybody, are you familiar with Ruth Moore? Everybody who's on the coast here in Maine ought to read Ruth. She was amazing. She grew up on Ghats, and she's written wonderful novels about the sort of end of the year-round island communities in the 1920s and 30s. But she was also a poet, and she wrote a really brilliant poem about the Indian shell mound on Ghats Island, which, the opening is just magic. In the quiet of the morning, the island lies still. And so I take the students out. We just sit in a circle in front of the station, and I read them that one. And it's sort of the history and natural history of Ghats Island for 1,000 years, all tied into one poem. And then Gordon Bok, who is, I think, the poet laureate of the Maine coast, has set several of her poems to music.
Oh, okay.
And again, we play those. And it's just, it's a magical interface between the human and the non-human, and between science and art. And all of that's what we call human ecology.
John, let's get back to the Lite station. The college, of course, has to keep the buildings in decent condition. What kind of restoration projects and improvements have been completed since College of the Atlantic took ownership?
To be perfectly honest, the station was in pretty bad condition when we got it. So, I wonder if our president had known the condition, if he would have let us take it. But we've benefited from some really generous supporters. We actually called the field station the Alice Eno Field Station, named after one of our incredibly generous trustees who basically sat me down and said, fix up that station of yours. And thanks to Alice, we were able to get the boat ramp completely rebuilt. It had been entirely destroyed before we got the island. We've had to re-shingle all the buildings and re-side them because the siding was all rotting out. The north end of the keeper's house, the silts had all rotted, and that was actually collapsing, and so that all needed to be replaced. Some features were actually in really good shape. We brought an electrician out, and I was afraid he was going to say, you have to rip out all the old wiring and start from scratch. And he just laughed, and he said, those old folks knew what they were doing. This is all really good wiring. It's in great shape. I can just, do the connections and make it safe for you. So we've installed a solar system that powers the station. So we're running entirely reusable as far as that goes. The only non-reusable energy we're using these days is a bit of propane for the stove. We've also fixed up the interior of the house. It was in very bad shape. The Coast Guard had put rather nasty plastic flooring down, and we've taken that up and put new wooden flooring in, and they had drop ceilings that were collapsing, and those are gone. And so the inside of the house as well as the outside is now much more livable. But the most important thing, first of all, was to get the ramp working so we actually had an easy landing, and then make sure the buildings were shedding water, so new shingles, and then the siding so they keep out the wind. And so it's been a very expensive undertaking, but I think it's been well worth it. And had we not done it, I don't think there'll be much of a station left by now.
I have one more question for you, John, for bonus points. What is your favorite thing about the work you've done over these years on Great Duck Island?
Oh, that's easy, the students. You know, they're a magical, magical crew, and they've gone on to do wonderful things. So I hate to boast, but literally every single duckling that's applied to graduate programs has gotten in so far. And they aren't just being scientists. Some of them are being lawyers, some of them being doctors, some of them are being vets, some of them being farmers. But it's been this wonderful, wonderful training ground where young people can really, really find themselves. To me, the greatest magic is the first day of a season where you've got half a dozen brand new kids who don't know what they're doing, and they're on the ramp, and they're getting in the way of each other, and they're tripping over everything. And then 7 weeks later, it's like a machine. Everybody knows what to do, and they're helping folks out of the boat, and they're getting things into the boat, and it goes like clockwork. And the sort of self-confidence and the sort of real internal balance that you get living for a couple of months on an island like this and learning how to run a station, it's just more valuable than anything else you could possibly imagine.
John Anderson, it's been a rare pleasure talking with you today. Congratulations on all you've accomplished. Keep up the great work. And thank you again so much for spending this time with me today, John.
Thank you so much indeed, and please do plan on coming back.
I visited Great Duck Island with John Anderson and some of his students back in 2002, and it was a great experience I'll never forget. I had the pleasure of getting reacquainted with him when we did the conversation in 2020, and it was nice to listen to it again for this episode. In a way, these interviews with John Anderson and Sean Todd are kind of a way for me to vicariously enjoy the efforts of students and faculty engaged in research on one of the most amazing parts of the planet. As a kid for years, I wanted to be a marine biologist. As often happens with childhood dreams, that idea faded, but it still occupies part of my brain. I guess my attraction to the ocean led to my interest in lighthouses. And as John Anderson says, the intersection of natural history and human history in a place like Great Duck Island Light Station is a fascinating thing to study. As I record this, I'm preparing to leave in a few days for the U.S. Lighthouse Society tour in France, where I'll be for most of the month of June. Be sure to check out uslhs.org for more information on preservation grants, the Passport Program, domestic and international tours, the research catalog, and everything the U.S. Lighthouse Society offers. I want to remind our listeners that Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses here on the New Hampshire seacoast has 2 sunset cruises coming up on June 20th and 27th. These cruises with Grand Estate Whale Watch are always a fun time, and they pass close to 3 beautiful and historic lighthouses. For more info and tickets, go to portsmouthnh.com, and use the calendar to navigate to June 20th and 27th. We'll be back with a new episode next week. Until then, to all our regular listeners and our new ones, thanks so much for listening, and keep a good light.
In the dark, I'm gonna let it shine. Out in the dark, I'm gonna let it shine. Out in the dark, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.